This talk actually starts about 40 years ago, back in 1980. There was a young political scientist named Langdon Winner who asked his colleagues a question, and it was supposed to be just a philosophical question. And it was at the time, but it's one that's become, I think, much more pertinent today. The question that Langdon Winner asked was, do artifacts have politics? And I usually ask that question to a room full of students, and I get a lot of really bewildered looks, like the looks that I see right now. I used to think that that was because my students were just deeply conflicted by this very philosophical question. It turns out, though, that no one was actually doing their homework, and the students had no idea what I was actually asking them. So I usually end up giving them the answer, and I will give you the answer as well. That answer is yes, artifacts do indeed have politics. But that's not a very satisfactory answer, right? And there's always one really smart student who will raise their hand and say, well, what do you mean by politics and what do you mean by artifacts? And I think that's a fair question. So let's start with that first word, artifacts. It's kind of a strange word, I think, to hear in this context, because when we think about it, we usually think of artifacts as the kinds of things that archaeologists dig up out of the ground and that we put in museums, right? They're cultural artifacts. But if you use the word technological artifact, that starts to become a bit more resonant, right? We sort of understand what a technological artifact is. And the smartphone that we all have in our pockets is a technological artifact, just like a piece of pottery that gets dug up out of the ground in ancient Greece. And that pottery, actually, in its day, was probably a very cutting-edge technology, just like our smartphones are. Now, that may be obvious when you say it that way, but I think there's some value in remembering that all of the artifacts that we dig up out of the ground, all of the artifacts that we carry around with us today, all of those technologies, they tell us something about the people who build them. They tell us something about the people who use them. That's the whole point of doing archaeology in the first place, right? We want to learn something about the societies that have existed by looking at their technologies, at their artifacts. And so the question that I think Langdon Winner is really asking is, how do technologies shape our society? He was asking that question almost 40 years ago now. And the technologies that were around in his time were very different than the ones we have today, right? So the personal computer back in 1980 was sort of just catching on. The idea of mobile computing was really just a thought experiment at that point. And so the kinds of technologies that Langdon Winner looked at were much more mundane. And one of the examples that he uses were the underpasses that were built on the Southern State Parkway in Long Island, in New York. And these underpasses were designed by a man named Robert Moses. Robert Moses was probably the most famous city planner of his time, maybe even of modern times. And he was famous, in fact, for inventing things like the suburbs. But he was also widely considered to be a classist and a racist. And one of the things that Robert Moses did when he built the Southern State Parkway was he made the underpasses about 20 inches shorter than underpasses in other parts of the city. And the reason he did that was because he did not want buses, public transportation, to be able to access the fancy new beach that he built over in Jones Beach, Long Island. And who was using public transportation at the time? Well, it was minorities and immigrants and poor people. People that Robert Moses did not want mingling on his new park. And so Robert Moses was really able to build his politics directly into that technology. And that technology, those underpasses, they're there in the world enforcing the politics of Robert Moses. And we have an example of this just up the road here at Georgetown, right? Georgetown does not have a metro stop, for example. And the story that I've heard as to why it doesn't have a metro stop is because the wealthy inhabitants of Georgetown did not want the poor, the migrants, the immigrants, the minorities to come to Georgetown on public transit. Now, I don't know if that story is true, actually. In fact, I imagine that if you know Georgetown, it's built on the side of a hill, and there's sort of a river right next to it. I imagine there's probably some really significant technological and financial challenges to putting a subway stop there. It doesn't really matter whether that story is true or not, whether Georgetown doesn't have a subway stop, a metro stop, because of anyone's intentional need to push people away, or if it's just an accident. The effect is the same. You still can't access Georgetown through public transit, and you still can't take a bus out to Jones Beach. And so when I think of the way that we build our beliefs into our technologies, right, the way that Robert Moses did, or we build our beliefs into the absence of technology, it doesn't have to be that way. So I can imagine that DC, the political town that it is, Maybe the residents got together and said, we think that any citizen of the District of Columbia should be able to access any part of this city at any time on public transit. If they did that, if they considered it to be a moral question, a question of ethics, maybe they would decide that they would find a way to build a metro station there. Maybe any costs would be easy to overcome if people were really dedicated to that. But we don't have a metro stop in Georgetown today, and we're not used to people actually doing that. And that's the other thing that Langdon Winner actually noticed, was that people are often very willing to endure a lot of inconveniences for technological progress, but they're in fact much less willing to make any kind of accommodation for social progress. And that's one thing that I hope that we can change. We've got a lot of new technologies right now. I think we've all sort of learned over the past couple of years that social media shapes technology in some very troubling ways. And I think we're about to unleash artificial intelligence onto the world. And I don't get the sense that we actually understand anything about how that technology will eventually shape our society. And so I think that really the core of what I'm trying to say here today is that whenever any of us, whether we're a developer or a user, whenever we introduce a new technology into our lives, we need to ask ourselves a few questions first. And we can start with the question that Langdon Winner asked. Do artifacts have politics? Now, the answer to that question is always going to be yes, and I hope you realize that now. So really, we need to find some harder questions to ask ourselves, which is good. We're making progress. So let's ask a more personal question. Are the politics of this technology my politics? Now, you may, in fact, answer yes to that question, and that's fine. You can sleep well at night if that's the case. But I think more often than not, what you will find is that the politics of any particular technology are very different from your personal politics. And so I think you need to ask yourself one more question. What is my responsibility to restore the balance that this technology has disrupted? Now, I'm not saying that you need to give up technology entirely. I think that would be a very difficult thing. I don't think any of us could do it, and I don't think we should. We get a lot of good benefits out of using technology. And I'm not really suggesting that you need to sort of change the world all on your own, all at once. What I do think, though, is that if we all decide to make some very small changes, then maybe we can start to try to restore the human connections that technology seems to have broken. So maybe you feel like social media keeps you in your echo chamber. Well, one thing you might want to do is to go out and have a real conversation with someone you disagree with, maybe over coffee or something. Maybe you believe that human relationships, that love and attraction shouldn't be reduced to swipes left or swipes right. Invite some friends over for a blind date. You can be creative here, because I think actually it doesn't matter what you do. What does matter is that you do something to help shape the society the way that you want it to be shaped. Because if you don't, then I think either by intention or by accident, our technologies will shape our society for us. And we will all eventually be left behind, very much like those people waiting for the metro to Georgetown or the bus to Jones Beach. Thank you.